Well, I have already been presented, but let me just repeat. I am head of section at the Ministry of Higher Education of Copenhagen in Denmark. Thank you very much. On the top of my first slide, you see the logo of the Danish presidency. Bologna is high politics in Denmark, to start there. Why is that? Well, for several hundred years, we are a small country. We have been trading with all over the world, sailing the high seas, trading pigs, and nowadays also wind turbines with foreign countries, buying nice German cars and iPads made in China. This is not only a question of trade nowadays. More and more researchers and students are at the forefront of this communication, this economic development, this economic interaction between countries. We send students, we send researchers in front of us and develop our economies with companies and persons coming after students and researchers. So in a way, higher education policy is high politics. It should be to us all. We have undertaken in Denmark a number of reforms during the recent decade, exactly implying the importance of what we are doing. So, ladies and gentlemen, you are important. Bologna is important. What we are talking about today is very important. Topics for today, thank you very much. Well, I don't need to say what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about Bucharest and what it implies. This is very difficult. Well, first of all, my congratulations also to our Romanian hosts. It was extremely impressive and a good experience to be in Bucharest, finalizing what we had been working on for, well, two years, but for the previous 6 or 7 months at least, that is writing the Bologna Communiqué. It was adopted on the 27th of April in this very grandiose hall in the presidential palace, the parliamentary palace of Bucharest. Well, what is the context of the communiqué? First of all, it's important to note, and you all are aware of that we are at different stages on the implementation of the Bologna tools and Bologna goals in our countries. So the implementation reports, which has just been published, shows that there are vast differences in countries' levels of implementation of the Bologna reform. And secondly, the important thing is that it is easy to implement Bologna tools on a political levels. It's far more difficult to implement it on the ground at university levels with students. And so in many of our countries, that is what the important thing is about, and that's also where you come in. What I haven't written on this slide is also that what we are in Europe in an economic and financial crisis. And the overarching discussion on the Bologna Communiqué was that it's important what higher education can do for the economies. We have to present to our governments in all our countries the vision, the evidence for the importance of higher education and present ourselves as servants to society because that is true, as I said before, but also in order to ensure that that the investment in higher education will continue in our countries in spite of the difficulties our finance ministers are in right now. This was the overarching discussion, I think, when we made the communiqué, and we made a structure in the communiqué, which I outline here on this slide: provide quality higher education for all, enhance graduates' employability, and strengthen mobility as a means for better learning. I'll just go through each of these 3 items. Goal 1, providing quality higher education for all. Well, the first item of this is widening access to higher education. In fact, what we're discussing under this item is 2 things. One is that most of our countries want to pass a larger share of each cohort of the population through higher education. That's a challenge to all our systems, but that's also necessary if we are to increase productivity in our populations, if we are to acquire growth and welfare in our economies. So that's a challenge to our system. Secondly, we must ensure that underrepresented groups get a good foothold at our higher education institutions. So widening access to higher education is about several things. We must focus on the social dimension, very important, also in the economic context we are in, but also very difficult, especially due to this economic context. We must support student-centered learning, strengthen quality assurance, that is the goal, providing quality higher education for all. And lastly, we mention, and I refer also to what Professor Mettinger said, that in this Bologna communiqué we are talking about wider issues than programs and quality assurance. We are facing the fact that funding and governance of our systems is important. You cannot have a good higher education system without, cannot have a good university, a good higher education institution, without looking into the issue of good governance. That is what we try to say. Enhancing students' employability, also referring to what Professor Mettinger said, we want to make higher education systems available to society. That's a question of making graduates employable. That's a question of making them graduates innovative through the programs. That's the question of discussing and finding out what is learning outcomes and make qualification frameworks work in practice. Relations between institutions and society, between institutions and businesses, we have to develop them not to make businesses take over universities, but to make a balanced relation between institutions and businesses. That's the way to make higher education serve society. Strengthening mobility for better learning. Well, one of the issues, very important steps forwards in Bucharest was that the ministers adopted a new strategy, mobility for better learning. This is very important because it outlines a number of tasks we all have to undertake to increase mobility, which of course is at the heart of the Bologna process. I'll return slightly to that later. We also discussed the issue of the promotion of possibility of grants and loans. That's a question of also of social dimension, as we term it in the Bologna process. The need for countries to develop their grant systems in order to make them portable so that students can go abroad with their grants and loans. We have to strengthen recognition procedures, I'll return to that, and we have to remove obstacles to joint programs and degrees. I have read with interest the small paper presented to all of you as part of the program material with a discussion on joint programs. We all have problems on that issue. New initiatives, system of voluntary peer learning and review, I'll return to that. Explore common standards for the third cycle. Presently, Bologna is primarily on the first and second cycle. There is and has been work undertaken with the third cycle. Third cycle is more difficult and should probably not be as regulated as two first cycles, but then because research collaboration is so important to all of us, as I said before, we need to do something more about the third cycle. We need to remove obstacles of joint programs and degrees, and we need, the Communiqué says, to explore possibilities for automatic recognition of comparable academic degrees. Few words more on the mobility strategy. Well, Bucharest confirmed that 20% of graduates in the year should have had a study or training period abroad. Very important and very important for ministers, I think, they thought, to bring home and use as a target in their national policies. The measures undertaken or proposed in the mobility strategy I outline beneath national and international and institutional internationalization strategies must be undertaken, and we have to dismantle obstacles on mobility. I have touched upon these issues before. We have to face that our national legislation is not always appropriate for mobility, and we have to face that. I'll return to that. And we must improve information on study programs abroad. Work ahead. Well, as Frank Petrovsky from the Commission mentioned, we had a meeting in Sarajevo among the board last week to discuss how to proceed. Bologna is not an easy process because all is voluntary, but then that's also the advantage of it. We have, however, to develop a good structure in order to be prepared for the right decisions to be taken in Armenia. I won't go into it. Frank has already said that we envisage a clearer structure and maybe a more reduced structure of working groups for the next 3 years in order to make sure that we get a real result in Armenia in 2015. I think when you go to the substance of work ahead, you can split it in two parts, or look at it in two as consisting of two issues. The one is the issue of wider implementation, what I touched upon earlier, that there are vast differences in where we are in the different countries, and there are challenges when taking what ministers easily can decide to the ground, to the institutions, to students. So there is an immense task to be undertaken there, and that was at the center of discussion. The other is that we have to keep the vision of the European higher education area in sight and move forward through new action lines. We cannot stop here. Why not? Well, the Bologna process that was discussed 2 years ago in Budapest, Vienna, has come a long way, but is it at the end? No, was the answer, and is the answer of Denmark. We are not at the end. This is clearly seen from all the obstacles which remain, and to mobility and to quality in our higher education systems, we must continue to have the vision of developing our EHEA area also for the coming years. Wider implementation, countries must be supported by the process, and we must ensure that reforms deliver real benefits on the ground to societies, institutions, students, and staff. We have agreed, or the ministers agreed, on a new peer learning and review initiative. Not at all easy, because everything has to be voluntary. This is not a forced review put on countries, but we see reviews as a way to have discussions at national levels or maybe among smaller groups of countries on how implementation of Bologna tools are actually moving forward in the individual country or group of countries. We also want to develop the structured peer learning activities. You are part of that in a way, but also to a larger extent in order to implement Bologna on a wider context. Need for deeper implementation? Well, it consists, as I see it, of two things. We have to further a common understanding of how institutions and programs can deliver more value for Europe, and we have to identify and address remaining obstacles to a real internal market for higher education. Let me take them one at a time. A common understanding, well, that is where we move, as I see it, into a wider context of higher education institution and systems policy. How do we ensure employable graduates? How do we make learning outcomes and qualification frameworks work in practice? How do we efficiently provide higher education for an increasing share of our population? Especially the last question is, of course, very broad. It takes on the issue of governance, the issue of financing, but then the first question mentioned, employable graduates, as I said before, we have big challenges in identifying what makes a graduate employable. So there are a number of tasks to be undertaken here, and they all have to be moved forward by developing this common understanding. A real internal market, well, the term market is not loved everywhere, but I think I will mention it, take it at the top of the slide nonetheless. Well, we are developing an internal market for learning mobility, aren't we? We need to acknowledge and realize that national educational legislation is mostly homegrown, because it's national competence within the EU, but then we have to ask ourselves, why are there differences? Or rather, the differences we see, do we want to stick to have these remain because they are part of our cultural differences which we want to prevail? Or are they in fact differences which only occur because our systems are homegrown and which we could easily remove? What remains before we will be able to automatically recognize? I'm not able to give the answer, but I think it was visionary of the ministers to agree that we should move towards a system where recognition is easier, at least, if not automatic. And all this has to be done without compromising the need for relevant diversity and autonomy. Here I've also tried to be slightly controversial by inserting the word relevant. A lot of people may think that this word is dangerous, but I think that we have to realize that diversity diversity among institutions should not be an excuse for not discussing what our common goals and structures should be. And the same with autonomy, when the major part of financing of many of our institutional systems come from the government, well, we have to have autonomy and at the same time accountability. A real internal market, we haven't come that far, we have to develop it further. The role of the Bologna experts, well, that is exactly where you come in. You have to assist this process in disseminating the thoughts both from governments, from the BFUG to institutions and students, and and not least the other way around. And so this conference is very important. This system of Bologna experts is extremely important to what we all are doing, and I hope that you will have a good and visionary conference. I hope that for all of us. Thank you very much.